Snow came in walls that January night, a white haze swallowing the switchbacks above Silverton and turning the San Juan peaks into the edge of a blank world. In January 1992, 41-year-old postal worker Daniel Mercer left the small town of Silverton, Colorado, to deliver mail through the mountain pass before a forecasted blizzard. He checked the chains twice, signed the manifest with a pencil that squeaked in the cold, and told the clerk he would beat the storm. He never arrived. His truck was found 2 days later, now stuck in a drift beyond a stand of spruce near a blind curve, buried to the windows. The engine still ticked under a crust of ice when the tow hooked on. The mailbag was gone. Locals said the highway, what outsiders called the $1 Million Road, ate men sometimes. They said he had gone off the road and perished in the storm, that avalanche debris and spring melt would take what was left down into the river cut. Search teams probed and called his name, dogs whined and turned circles on wind-packed slopes. No body surfaced. No mailbag. For weeks the only color in that country was the red of ski patrol flags. By March, Silverton's gossip had hardened into a kind of truth. Daniel made a brave but foolish call, and the mountain took him. But people remembered who he was, and memory refused to fit the easy version. Daniel Mercer grew up the son of a mechanic and a switchboard operator, a boy who knew every alley where ice hid in shade, a man who ran the mail with a stubborn, quiet decency. He kept his gloves patched with duct tape. He learned all the dogs along his route and carried biscuits. He finished overtime without complaint when holiday catalogs flooded boxes. He played guitar on Fridays at the Miners' Rest and never raised his voice. The smallness of his habits made his disappearance feel personal, not myth. In the Silverton post office, above the brass-slotted P.O. boxes and the corkboard of yard sales, a photograph of him in his blue jacket hung with a worn black ribbon. On the second morning after the storm, Sheriff Doyle stood in the wind-carved parking turnout where the truck sat crucified in ice and stared at the empty passenger footwell. No slush. No footprints leading away. The passenger door showed a smear that looked like grease, but the lab swab came back as road grime. The heater fan had spun until the battery died. Someone had turned the key, then turned it again. The ignition had fought back with that toothed grind that made mechanics wince. The odometer told a dull story. He made it through town, climbed, and stopped here. If Daniel had gone over the side, there would be disturbed cornices and broken tops along the edge. There were none. If Daniel had panicked and tried to walk out, there would be tracks leading to the trees. There were none either, only the animal scribbles of a fox and the wind's erasing hand. The mailbag not being in the truck felt strange, but strange things happened in blizzards. The sheriff wrote what he knew and what he believed and filed both. In Daniel's small house at the edge of town, his sister Katie sat at the kitchen table under the cuckoo clock and held a yellow pad like it might tell her something. She and Daniel had fallen into a quiet rhythm after their mother's stroke. He did the morning rounds at the post office, then checked in, tightened the old window latches, replaced a fuse, ate a bowl of chili at the counter, and left a note, always a note, if he headed back out. On the day of the blizzard he left, back by 7:00. The note stayed pinned by the magnet shaped like a trout. His boots stayed by the door, the spare laces coiled inside. The life he had built was not a life of running. When the snows receded to gray lines in the gullies, summer hikers returned, and Daniel's name slid lower in the paper. A small church held a service. A cardboard box gathered sympathy cards. He delivered our last Christmas letter on time. He never minded when the dog got loose. The postmaster, a man whose hair had turned white quickly, spoke about routes and honor and the old creed about snow and rain and heat and gloom of night. He left out blizzards. Years turned, and the edges of Daniel's absence dulled in the way edges always did in mountain towns. Smoothed by other emergencies, other winters. The photograph in the post office faded. Fatigue softened the righteous anger of those who said, even then, that something had been wrong at the Silverton post office. The one person who kept touching the bruise of that thought was Katie. She kept a file box under her bed with clipped articles and a photocopy of the manifest from January 14, 1992. In that list of names were winter addresses and a registered envelope from the Silverton branch addressed to a Denver firm, and a payroll envelope that meant nothing then and meant everything later. She circled the scrawl A. Blake next to a line in the staff roster. Arthur Blake had been Daniel's supervisor. He had been soft-spoken, with a tidy desk and a way of smoothing tape across packages that looked like he was wrapping wounds. He transferred out in August 1992 and retired to Arizona a few years later. He sent a single card for the memorial, with a note, "Daniel was the best of us," written in precise, slanted script. In the spring of 2029, when the high sun took back a winter that had cut deep into the mountain, two hikers moving along the old route above the rock cut saw a rectangle of brown emerging from blue ice. The leather looked like the back of a drowned animal. They thought at first of a backpack, then the stamp of an eagle crest rose in relief under the melt, U.S. mail. The glacier, which locals called a glacier and scientists called a perennial ice field, had a habit of chewing and spitting things decades later: tools, a broken ski, a rust-eaten hubcap. But never this. The hikers took photographs with their gloves still on and called the sheriff. When the crew cut the bag free in a series of careful, tea-colored sprays of meltwater, the leather cracked but held. The strap was petrified in a loop. The brass buckle shone in one place where the ice had polished it. They drove it to Durango in the back of a county truck like it was a casket and set it on a stainless table under humming lights. The bag's contents held air that had not breathed since January. Inside lay dozens of letters in their winter colors: off-white, blue, manila, with stamps featuring flags and Elvis and the Olympic torch. They were still sealed, glossed with ice, the ink crisp and cranky from the cold. All were sealed, except for one. That single envelope, postmarked January 14, 1992, held its flap torn along the gummed line as if fingers had worried it open in gloves. It contained a single typed page. The words sat square and implacable on the paper: I, Arthur Blake, confess. The rest unraveled with the calm of a ledger: dates, amounts, patterns, an embezzlement scheme at the Silverton post office that siphoned small amounts from money orders and change left clumsily unbalanced by holiday temps. It described how the person who typed this feared discovery and prepared to make it right. It asked for forgiveness in the abstract. It did not ask for pity. The crime lab lifted fingerprints from the letter that matched old, clean prints in a long sleeping personnel file stamped with a name everyone knew. Fingerprints on the envelope matched Daniel's supervisor, Arthur Blake himself, who had retired to Arizona in the late 1990s and died in 2017. The lab tech who read the hit aloud had to sit down afterward. Suddenly a narrative that had spent 3 decades as weather turned human. The bag and ice and the engine that had still been warm and the missing mailbag that was no longer missing fit into a new shape, and the new shape was ugly. The avalanche team and the sheriff went back to the ice with ground-penetrating radar and a quiet that felt ceremonial. Forensic testing confirmed that Daniel had been shot before the avalanche. The bullet they dug from the ice held its lines as if time had done nothing to it. It came out of the glacier like a coin. Daniel's body, still frozen, lay just a few meters from the mailbag, curled in the posture of a man trying to keep himself small against weather that did not care. The coroner's voice broke on the word frozen. Katie stood on the moraine, scarf over her mouth, and stared at the shape under white plastic. After 37 years. The storm finally gave up its secret, and the truth behind the Snowbound Letter was revealed. But truth in a small town never arrived clean. It arrived with old grudges, domestic reluctance, and a need to tell the story in a way that left everyone with some scrap of dignity. In the days after the discovery, the past unfurled in rooms that smelled like coffee and dust. People remembered that in January 1992 Arthur Blake had moved like an anxious man. He had closed his office door more often. He had ordered the safe relined. He had chatted too long with the clerk who counted postal money orders. He had told Daniel to take the high route before the storm, though Daniel preferred to wait storms out and make the push at dawn when the road crews finished clearing. He had insisted the payroll envelope head out same day to Denver because deadlines mattered. A few old-timers recalled a raised voice through a door the week before, The kind of raised voice you tried not to notice because people deserved privacy. It had sounded like Daniel's, which in itself was shocking. "I can't carry this," someone had heard, "and we're not like other offices," someone else said they heard later, when they could no longer be sure what memory and rumor had braided together. In 1992, nobody had imagined that a typed confession would someday thaw out of a glacier and point back to that closed door. Investigators rebuilt the last afternoon like a ghost walk. In January 1992, 41-year-old postal worker Daniel Mercer had loaded the bag with letters and packages and the payroll envelope printed with a green stripe. He had signed the manifest. He had walked past Arthur Blake's office door. Arthur might have stopped him. Perhaps he said something about weather windows and duty. Perhaps Daniel, who hated leaving things half-finished, nodded and pulled on his heavy gloves. Out on Green Street, snow blurred the church steeple. The first miles climbed under a sky that pressed lower by the minute. The truck's heater groaned bravely. Somewhere before the blind curve, where the spruce leaned out like eaves, the truck slowed. Another vehicle's tires had laid a shallow angle across the road that afternoon, and the pattern froze under fresh snow, a detail that meant little in 1992 and meant a lot now. In the snug quiet of his cab, Daniel might have seen headlights in his mirror. He might have recognized the grille. He might have thought, with relief or irritation, that Arthur had come to make sure the envelope made it down, or to retrieve it, or to take something back that had already gone too far. What happened by the drift, forensic markers suggested, had been brief and imprecise. A door opened. Cold struck like a slap. A voice, Arthur's careful, flattened voice, spoke a reasonable sentence about taking the bag to be safe, about the weather, about some policy that could have been real or invented. Daniel stepped down, boots punching prints that would fill and vanish. He refused to hand the bag over. He refused because rules mattered to him more than being liked, and because that payroll packet had a weight in his mind that 1,000 envelopes never had. In the scuffle, or in the shove, the road's edge crumbled a little under his heel. The report of the gun cracked and went straight upward into a sky that already roared. Snow above them hung on by threads, and threads snapped. The avalanche ran like a landing airplane, solid and inevitable. The man who fired had a second to understand that the mountain had taken his choice out of his hands. He grabbed at the bag, or maybe to free himself from it, and the strap broke. The mailbag rolled once, twice, then slid in a white broom of moving surface, and the men fell out of each other's sight. Arthur Blake drove down alone. He parked his car under a ridge where blowing snow hardened quickly into armor. He returned to town with a face so pale the clerk asked if he was ill. He typed a confession, because guilt pulled words out of him like a dentist pulling a tooth, and because some part of him believed paper would shift the weight from his chest to the world. He typed in his office with the door closed while the clock over the counter ticked and Katie's phone rang and rang. Then he slipped the letter into an envelope, addressed it in his own precise hand to no one, only to whom it may concern, postmarked it to give it dignity, and, this remained the part that obscured him, that made people argue in diners later, he took it out into the storm looking for the very bag that had gone. The letter found the bag later in ice and kept its secret for 3.5 decades. Arthur retired to Arizona in the late 1990s, where the air did not smell like snow, and died in 2017 with a neat desk and a shelf of labeled photo albums. Back in Silverton in 2029, people stood at their mailboxes longer than they needed to and stared at the flagged doors like altars. Reporters came in, their boots too clean, and asked small questions in bright voices. The old clerk, the one who had learned to count money orders by feel, told them that a post office was a church of trust wearing fluorescent lights. She told them that in January 1992 they had all trusted the wrong man because he sounded like a right man. She told them about Daniel, how he had once waded through a drift to bring 5 letters to a miner's widow who had not had mail in weeks, how he had marked a Christmas card special and driven it out after hours because he knew the name on it would matter, how he had sat with a dead package until someone claimed it just so it would not feel alone on the shelf. Katie cleaned her kitchen table the way you cleaned a place after a storm receded, slowly, pushing the rag in circles until stubborn rings finally lightened. She spread out the letters from the bag that could be returned and made a list. She planned a small ceremony at the pass, not to dramatize grief but to place it. She asked the sheriff if they could lay Daniel in the town cemetery near their mother. The sheriff said yes, in a voice that had learned how to say yes to things that should have been easy 30 years earlier. At the grave, the postmaster read from the old creed and flinched when he reached the line about snow. A boy from town played Wildwood Flower on a guitar with cold fingers. The wind moved through the spruces like a thing alive and kind. In the back, a man raised his hand and asked if this meant the case was truly closed. The sheriff said that the letter from Arthur Blake told one piece of it. He said that forensics told another. He said that a town's memory told a third. He did not say closed. He had learned that stories did not close, they widened and revealed other edges. News about Arthur Blake spread through Arizona like a heat shimmer, thin and unbelieved by the few who had known him there as a man who kept a tidy yard, who attended a Rotary Club breakfast and always offered to pour coffee, who once donated a stack of stamps to a school drive. A woman who had dated him briefly in 1998 remembered a night where he woke shouting in a voice she did not recognize, a single word, bag, and would not explain. She came forward after reading about the glacier bag and cried in her car before going in to speak to the detective because the human heart did not know what to do with the collision of kindness and harm. The Denver firm that never received the payroll envelope in 1992 wrote a letter to the town in 2029 offering condolences, as if money could apologize to a mountain. A retired auditor dug into records and found the small, regular bleed that had fed Arthur's secret. It was not lavish. It did not speak of greed that wanted boats or trips, only of a man who had made a wrong move and then tried to tidy it with a dozen smaller wrong moves until he had built himself a walled garden. In that garden, Daniel had walked in with a letter in his hand and refused to accept a view of duty that bent for convenience. The auditor's report read like a lament. He sent it to Katie with a note that said, in handwriting made shaky by age, "I should have seen it then." As spring deepened in 2029, the ice above the pass let go of other things. A wool cap. A key with a tab of red plastic. A flashlight whose batteries had corroded to mint green crust. Each item added detail to the last hours of in January 1992, 41-year-old postal worker Daniel Mercer, and each refused to be the last word. The sheriff boxed them and labeled the box not with the word evidence, but with Daniel's name. He placed it on a shelf at eye level in the small evidence room where dust motes drifted like slow snow and locked the door. In town, people began to write letters again. Not emails, not messages that evaporated in blinking cursors, but paper letters addressed in careful script. They wrote to old friends and lost cousins and a version of themselves they had been in 1992. They wrote to Daniel Mercer and left the envelopes on his grave, and the wind slid its edges under the flaps and made a sound like reading. Children asked their parents why a man would confess on paper and then not fix the thing he confessed. Parents said that sometimes people told the truth to the only witness they could face. A teacher in the school by the river assigned a unit on primary sources. He brought to class a photocopy of the Snowbound Letter with the names redacted and asked his students what a confession did to a story and what a body did and what a town did when both arrived late. Katie walked the old route once that summer, not to punish grief with altitude but to measure the distance between what she had imagined and what had been. She stopped where the drift had buried the truck and closed her eyes. She pictured Daniel's last clear thought before white. She did not ask it to speak. Down the switchbacks, she paused at a carved heart in a rail from 1989 that said D+M. Daniel had carved it for their mother Mary one day after fixing a rattle under her sink. She put her palm over it as if it could warm her hand. Reporters left, then podcasters came. They sat with microphones in the Miner's Rest and tried to catch the way voices fell and rose when a town examined itself. They asked about Arthur's voice, about the exact color of the envelope, about how the letter felt in the lab tech's hand. The lab tech said it felt like normal paper. He said the weight didn't live in the fiber, it lived in the words. He said he washed his hands 3 times afterward without knowing why. He said he dreamed of white, and in the white, a man in a blue jacket walked toward him with something in his hand that the dream never let him see. At the post office, the photograph of Daniel came down for a week so a new print could replace the faded. The clerk who did the work sat with the old frame on her lap and traced the lines of Daniel's face. She remembered the day he taught her how to feed miscut stamps through the machine without jamming it. She remembered him laughing once, twice at most, but when he did the sound carried. She remembered that in January 1992, when he left for the pass, she had said, "Be careful," and he had lifted the bag and said, "Always." She hung the new photograph and stepped back. People came in just to look. The fluorescent light did what it could to honor him. No one pretended there would be a clean last page. A man who had worked nights loading pallets in 1992 now sat alone on his back steps in 2029 and smoked and turned Arthur's name over like a pebble in his mouth. He remembered a single kindness, the day Arthur helped him write a letter to his daughter, and he did not know where to put it now. A woman who had fought with Daniel at a neighborhood meeting about snow shoveling rules cried because the fight had been small and because she had held on to it as if it were large. The sheriff read the ballistic report again at his desk with his pen in his hand and underlined, pointlessly, the line that said the shot had been from a close distance. He did it because underlining was something to do. At night, snowmelt rivers said their endless thing against rocks polished by centuries. Above them, the pass lay bare and brown and then white again with new weather. Hikers moved along the old route and told each other, in low voices, the story of in January 1992, 41-year-old postal worker Daniel Mercer and the leather bag and the letter that melted out of time. They did not agree on every detail. They did not need to. In each telling, Daniel's stubborn decency held. In each telling, Arthur Blake's tidy hands hovered over a keyboard and struck a deal with guilt that paper could not keep. In each telling, the mountain kept and then returned what mattered. And in Silverton, each morning, someone lifted the striped flag on a mailbox and trusted the invisible line that had bound the town long before 1992 and long after 2029, the hope that a letter would leave one hand and arrive, entire, in another. They began to thaw the letters one at a time, not with heat lamps or impatience, but with shallow trays of room temperature air and a patience that made the forensic lab feel like a monastery. A postal inspector from Denver, a woman named Elena Ruiz who had worked fraud cases for 20 years, stood with her arms folded and watched each envelope loosen, its paper fibers exhaling the winter of in January 1992, when 41-year-old postal worker Daniel Mercer left Silverton, Colorado, to deliver mail through the mountain pass before a forecasted blizzard. He never arrived, now the past arrived for him in small, paper breaths. The rule was simple, unless court-ordered, they would not open what had remained sealed. The duty was simpler still, they would try, where possible, to deliver every letter to its intended recipient or to the nearest living kin, with an explanatory note and an apology that was both official and human. The first deliverable piece went to a woman in Farmington, New Mexico, who had been 21 in 1992 and was 78 now. It was a postcard from her brother at basic training, a photograph of a dusty parade ground under a bleached sky. On the back, in block letters that had not faded in the cold, he had written, "I think I'm going to be okay. Tell Mom I'm eating." The woman held it with both hands and made a sound that wasn't a sob so much as the release of a spring inside the chest. She said that their mother had died thinking he hated the army. She pressed the card to her cheek, the way people do with objects that cannot press back. Another letter was addressed to a law office in Denver and contained a simple estate notice, an executor request with a list of assets that included a parcel number in La Plata County and a safety deposit key number inked in blue. The office had moved twice since 1992. The firm existed now only as a new name on a door, a continuity of case files and phone numbers. An associate in 2029, curious and unwilling to let go of a mystery with teeth, followed the parcel to a plot of land along a river bend. The title had become a knot when the notice failed to arrive. The current occupant had paid taxes without a clear deed for 30 years. The associate drove down with a box of copies, knocked on a screen door, and explained to a man in a John Deere hat that a letter from a glacier might finally let him own what he had been stewarding all that time. He laughed once, sharp, then said, "My wife always thought that land was waiting to decide about me." He walked her out to a cottonwood and patted the bark as if it were a dog. A third piece was small and domestic, a pink envelope with a cartoon heart, addressed to a miner at a boarding house on Green Street. The miner would have been 45 then. He would have been 82 now, if he'd lived. He had not. The boarding house had become a gift shop with a rack of postcards and a bell that rang too brightly. The envelope reached instead a daughter in Idaho who had been 9 in 1992 and grew up believing her father had walked away from them out of coldness. She slit the envelope along the short edge, hands shaking, and found a child's drawing tucked inside, a stick figure man holding a stick figure girl's hand, colored with waxy crayons and impatient blocks. On the back, her father had written, "This is how I carry you. I'll be there on your birthday." He never was. A rock she had carried like a charm in the dark of her pocket for 3 decades shifted shape. Katie volunteered to help track recipients. The work steadied her. It gave her a way to be with in January 1992, 41-year-old postal worker Daniel Mercer without having to sit in a room with photographs and silence. She drove to Durango, to Ouray, to Aztec, with the sheriff's blessing and a canvas tote full of envelopes and forms. People invited her inside when she told them who she was. They pressed coffee on her and watched her face the way people watch weather, looking for signs. She developed a habit of telling a small, unadorned version of the story twice, once to anchor it for a stranger, once to anchor it for herself. She kept a spiral notebook where she wrote the names of those who cried, those who laughed, those who could not decide, those who said nothing, and put the letter in a drawer without opening it, as if the seal could still be a kind of prayer. The postal inspector Elena Ruiz built a timeline that did what good timelines do: it made it hard for convenient lies to stand up. She returned to the numbers that had been invisible in 1992 because the world had been full of bigger, louder numbers then: Olympic medals and interest rates and snowpack charts. She logged petty cash reconciliation sheets, money order serials, refund slips, the routine audit schedule Arthur Blake had nudged 1 week here, 1 week there, as if moving a meeting could move fate. The pattern that emerged was not the rough grab of a greedy hand but the careful, almost apologetic drift of a man telling himself he would fix it next cycle. It somehow made it worse. Elena brought in a retired OIG man who had seen every way a small office could betray itself, and he traced a finger along the dates and said, "He always meant to clean it up tomorrow." He tapped the day Daniel disappeared. Tomorrow never came. A memory surfaced in town like a coin in churned snow. In the week before, in January 1992, 41-year-old postal worker Daniel Mercer vanished. Arthur Blake had been in the back room with the door shut, teaching himself to type with his eyes closed. The clerk who remembered it said she'd found him there, the lights off, his fingers moving in the old rhythm of a typing class metronome, the carriage return ding a tiny bell in the dark. It had unsettled her then. It made sense now, and making sense felt like a betrayal of pity. The confession letter itself, the Snowbound Letter, moved through hands like something alive. Photographs of it ran in newspapers. The font looked antique to 20-year-olds and ordinary to 60-year-olds. The G had a loop the lab could track back to a specific model of office machine that the post office had used in the early 1990s. A linguist at the university in Gunnison, unasked but compelled, wrote a neat, narrow paper about its constructions, the avoidance of first-person pronouns after the opening sentence, the way it slid from I to one, the way passive voice spread like ice over action. Errors were made. Funds were moved. Trust was breached. Words that held bodies at arm's length so the man who wrote them did not have to feel a pulse through the page. In Silverton, the town council voted to mark a small turnout on the pass. They named it Mercer's Bend, and someone, no one admitted it, nailed to the spruce a simple wooden box labeled letters. Tourists left notes with ink that ran in the weather, notes that said, "For the father I did not understand," and "For the woman at the Farmington diner who never learned I loved her pie," and "For you, Daniel." Maintenance workers emptied the box once a week and handed the damp stack to the clerk, who dried them on paper towels behind the counter, steam rising from the radiator like prayers. Podcasters kept arriving, and with them came a different kind of memory, the kind that lived in the minds of people who had not been asked before because they were on the edges. A snowplow driver who had been new in 1992 remembered a sedan behind the post truck at the curve, remembered only that it had a missing hubcap on the rear driver's side. A teenager who had smoked on the high school's back steps remembered seeing Arthur at the gas station that afternoon, pumping fuel and staring at the mountain the way men stare at water they know will be cold. These fragments were unhelpful alone; together, they made a lattice for the official story to cling to. Katie found herself one evening sitting at the Miners' Rest with a woman she did not know, Catherine Blake, Arthur's niece. The younger woman had driven up from Phoenix on a whim made heavy by months of reading about her uncle and trying not to hear her mother's old stories about how gentle he'd been. How he'd collected coins and taught the children cribbage, how he had saved napkins at restaurants to fold into cranes. Catherine held a manila envelope as if it might bruise, then slid it across the table. Inside was a photograph of Arthur as a young man, in a cheap suit beside a cheaper car, and a note, "For Katie. Because we are both the ones left to carry." Catherine cried without apology, and Katie reached for her hand even as her mouth tightened with all the things she could say and chose not to. In that moment, kindness did not erase harm, and harm did not erase kindness. The human ledger refused to balance cleanly, and perhaps that was the truest thing the story had taught anyone since the Snowbound Letter thawed into daylight. A quiet curiosity took root around Daniel Mercer's life before 1992. A former girlfriend from 1987 sent Katie a cassette tape he had made, 3 songs on a battered Panasonic boombox, the guitar going out of tune by the end. His voice was low and steady, the kind that made space for other things in the room. The second song, a halting version of If I Needed You, ended with him laughing when he lost the words. Katie played the tape in her kitchen as she sorted delivery confirmations for the Glacier mail. The sound folded the years like a map. A boy named Mason, 12, freckled, curious in the way of children who have been loved enough to feel safe asking, found a cracked plastic flashlight near the pass where in January 1992, 41-year-old postal worker Daniel Mercer had vanished. He turned the head and it gave once, grudgingly. When he shook it, something rattled inside. He took it home, opened it on a towel, and shook into his palm not batteries, which had long ago turned to chalk, but a tiny, folded square, the way men in the 1970s and 80s used to carry phone numbers. The pencil had smudged but survived. Mary, Tuesday 4 p.m., document. Mary had been Daniel and Katie's mother. The date matched the week before the storm. Mason brought the paper to the sheriff because in this town a 12-year-old knew the difference between a treasure and a clue. The sheriff smiled at him in a way that would make the boy remember the moment when he grew into a man. He made a copy for Katie. She flattened it between glass. It meant nothing and everything at once, proof that her brother had been a sun in motion, thinking of appointments and oil changes and winter salt, not a myth or a martyr. A man who wrote down reminders and kept them where he could see them. Elena Ruiz, restless in the way of investigators who cannot leave a corner unlit, sat at her hotel desk one night and wrote a letter to 1992 in her head. It started like this: if you could see us now, if you could see a town making space for both grief and complexity, would you have written your letter differently, Arthur? Would you have walked out into the storm with Daniel and said the thing you could not say in that office? She did not write the letter down. She got up, put on her coat, and stood outside under stars as sharp as pins. Above her, the pass held its dark line. Media did what media always did, they made frames big enough for people far away to step into. A documentary crew shot the post office from a dozen angles so that it looked both holy and ordinary. They clipped a mic to Katie, and she answered questions not by flinching, but by refusing the comfort of hate. She did not forgive Arthur Blake in public. She did not damn him either. She said his name and her brother's name as if they were both heavy to lift and she had learned how. She said, in January 1992, 41-year-old postal worker Daniel Mercer left Silverton to deliver the mail and never arrived. A letter and a glacier brought him back. I'm trying to carry both truths without letting one erase the other. The producer nodded, grateful for a line he could use. Later, he sat in his hotel room and called his mother and asked if there were any letters of his father's he had never seen. Strange things settled and stirred in the wake of the Snowbound Letter. A former carrier from a neighboring town confessed, quietly, at his own kitchen table, to pocketing a book of commemorative stamps in 1991 that he had meant to pay for and never did. He mailed the equivalent cost with interest to the Silverton branch with an unsigned note that said, "Doing this because Daniel did not bend when it mattered." A woman who had not spoken to her sister since the mid-90s wrote a letter in sharp, careful script and mailed it to an address she hoped still held. It arrived. The sister called. They talked about postage before they talked about anything else, because sometimes you had to approach love sideways. The glacier kept its own counsel but continued, in its way, to speak. A highway crew, replacing a guardrail post loosened by freeze-thaw, dug up a flattened coin that had been soldered into the earth by time. It was a wheat penny, 1944, polished smooth by weather and thumb. On its face, in scratches a knife point might have made on a slow afternoon, was the name D. Mercer. The sheriff turned it over in his palm and thought of a boy at a kitchen table, bored, spinning a coin and making it his. He gave it to Katie because he could not bear to lock it in a drawer. She set it on the windowsill where the afternoon light would find it. The town chose a day in late summer for a walk up the pass. Not a parade, not a pilgrimage, but a simple walk with jackets tied at waists and sandwiches in paper bags. People carried envelopes they did not intend to mail, notes to themselves, to lost ones, to the men whose names bound the story, to in January 1992, 41-year-old postal worker Daniel Mercer who had carried their lives in canvas and leather, and to Arthur Blake, whose letter had been both a wound and a suture pulled too soon. On the way up, they told each other pieces of the story out of order and did not worry about sequencing. At Mercer's Bend, they placed their envelopes in the wooden box and did not wait for answers. A deputy found himself, months later, rereading Arthur's confession at his desk and thinking of his father, a man of rules who had once told him that the smallest lies were the heaviest to carry because they didn't announce themselves. You had to remember to keep them in your pocket. He thought of Arthur's tidy hands, of the typed lines that had slipped responsibility into grammar like a frog into a pond. He wrote a single word in the margin, cowardice? Then crossed it out, then wrote, smaller, fear, then crossed that out, too. He finally wrote human and shut the folder because some words exhausted him. A tourist from Texas, standing in line at the post office with a package of cookies for a grandson at college, asked the clerk if she had known Daniel. The clerk said yes. The tourist asked what he had been like. The clerk said, the kind of man who would come out from behind the counter to carry your box to the car if your hands were full. The tourist nodded and, later that night in a rented cabin, wrote a letter to her grandson telling him to be more like that. He texted her back a heart emoji, which was not a letter but was its descendant. On a Monday morning in early fall, Elena Ruiz visited the pass alone. She had finished her paperwork. The case file now had words like closed on stickers that clung to the spine with a resignation she did not share. She parked, zipped her coat, and walked to the rail. The air at altitude had the clean, almost metallic taste it gets when the first snow isn't far. She rested her hands on the cold metal and spoke Daniel Mercer's name out loud because some names deserved to be said into open air. She said, "You did your job," and felt foolish and right at once. She said, "We found what we could," and the wind took the words apart and made them into something else along the slope. Down in town, Katie folded the tape recorder into a quilt of spare towels and placed it in a shoebox with the penny and the phone number slip from the flashlight and a photocopy of the confession letter, items that, together, weighed more than they should and still could not equal a person. She added the spiral notebook where she had written recipients' names and little notes, smiled, kept envelope unopened, and shook my hand too long, and gave me a jar of chokecherry jam. She wrote on the lid in black marker, Daniel's story, not finished. She slid the box under her bed because she could not yet put it on a shelf. Some stories wanted the dark, not to hide, but to keep. As dusk settled early, as it does in towns hemmed in by peaks, people began to notice that strangers in rental jackets came not for skiing, but to stand inside the small post office and read the creed over the door like scripture. They touched the brass doors of P.O. boxes and swapped their reflections for a second. They spoke quietly and looked at the photograph of in January 1992, 41-year-old postal worker Daniel Mercer, his smile small, his eyes looking just off camera, the way a person looks when someone they love is in the room. They left, and the bell over the door gave its mild ring, and the clerk went back to the work of moving small, important things from one set of hands to another. By winter, snow began again. It came with less drama than the one that had swallowed 1992, but with the same old authority. Road crews layered gravel on the curves. The sheriff replaced the wiper blades on his cruiser himself, a ritual that felt like preparation and humility. Katie bought salt and stored it in buckets by the door. Elena went back to Denver and read a new case file about numbers that did not add up, but some part of her had been pressed into the ice at Silverton and would never fully thaw. She found herself, in idle moments, typing a sentence into the Notes app on her phone and deleting it and typing it again. After 37 years, the storm finally gave up its secret, not because she liked the drama, but because the truth of it consoled her. The way weather, indifferent and immense, had nonetheless returned what a town needed to say a name correctly. On an afternoon when the clouds sat low and the mountains wore shawls, a man walked into the post office with a long, narrow package and a nervous smile. He was the son of the gas station owner who had seen Arthur at the pump in 1992. He set the package on the counter and pushed it gently toward the clerk. "For Katie," he said. Inside lay a wooden sign carved by his father that winter long ago, never hung, that read, "Mercer's Route." He had kept it in the garage rafters for years, dust settling on the curves of the letters like the world's softest blanket. He had not known where to take it. Now he knew. The clerk ran her fingers over the O in route until a sliver of wood lifted and she caught it with her nail, the smallest splinter. She smiled and said, "We'll find the right place," and meant the sign, and meant the story, and meant the grief that had learned to walk without limping. Night came down early over Silverton. Inside kitchen windows, lamps threw warm circles onto tables. The mail sat in tidy stacks by stoves, next to salt and pepper, like companions. People opened envelopes with butter knives and thumbs. They unfolded pages and made the small intake of breath that belongs to letters alone. And somewhere up on the pass, the wooden box at Mercer's Bend filled slowly, the notes inside softening in the damp, the ink holding as long as it could, the mountain listening, the wind reading aloud in a voice no one could quite hear but everyone could feel, carrying, always carrying, the names of Daniel Mercer and Arthur Blake forward into another winter without promising, ever, to finish. Snow settled in the seams of the town like flour on an old apron as they chose a day to finish saying what had needed 37 winters to be said. In January 1992, 41-year-old postal worker Daniel Mercer had left the small town of Silverton, Colorado, to deliver mail through the mountain pass before a forecasted blizzard. He never arrived. His truck was found 2 days later, buried in snow, engine still warm, and the mailbag missing. For 37 years, the disappearance remained one of Colorado's most enduring cold cases, until the spring of 2029, when hikers discovered a leather mailbag frozen deep inside a glacier near the old route. Inside were dozens of preserved letters, still sealed, except for one. That single envelope, postmarked January 14, 1992, contained a typed confession note from a man named Arthur Blake, admitting to an embezzlement scheme at the Silverton post office. Fingerprints on the envelope matched Daniel's supervisor, Arthur Blake himself, who had retired to Arizona in the late 1990s and died in 2017. Forensic testing confirmed that Daniel had been shot before the avalanche. His body, still frozen, was found a few meters from the mailbag. After 37 years, the storm had given up its secret, and the truth behind the Snowbound Letter was revealed. By the time leaves browned on the aspens again, there remained only one undeliverable piece from the glacier bag, a plain white envelope with a smudged return address that no longer existed, addressed simply to General Delivery, Silverton. No one owned it, and therefore everyone did. Katie kept it in a small cedar box on her kitchen counter next to the wheat penny with D. Mercer scratched into it, the tiny folded reminder that said, "Mary, Tuesday 4 p.m., Doc," and a cassette with her brother's voice going out of tune. She told herself she would decide where the last letter belonged when the right moment presented itself. It came, as such moments do in mountain towns, without announcement. The town council set a date for a dedication at Mercer's Bend before snow shut the high road. Children traced the letters on the new bronze plaque with mittened fingers while their parents stood back and practiced listening. The plaque carried no grand rhetoric, just a name, a date, and a line from the old postal creed carved plain: neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night, the rest hung in the air, implied, imperfect, human. Elena Ruiz drove down from Denver, the case file closed but still warm in her thoughts. The sheriff spoke briefly, not as a man who solved a mystery but as one who had finally been allowed to tell it straight. He said Daniel Mercer's name, then Arthur Blake's, and did not let his voice harden around either. The postmaster read a list of the Glacier letters that had found their way at last, and people nodded, remembering the astonished faces, the relieved tears, the awkward laughter when old paper met the present and did not quite know how to behave. Katie stepped forward with the cedar box. She lifted the undeliverable letter and turned it in the thin light until the faint January postmark showed, January 14, 1992, one last breath from the day in January 1992. 41-year-old postal worker Daniel Mercer had lifted the leather strap and walked out into weather that had already made up its mind. She did not open the letter. It had kept its silence through a blizzard, through a long melt, through a glacier's slow, patient grip. She placed it inside the wooden letters box at the rail, where tourists and truckers had been leaving notes all summer, apologies with no addresses, thank yous without return instructions, small admissions that belonged to no court and every kitchen table. The lid fell shut with a dulled click. For a second the breeze lifted the edge of the envelope as if to read, then thought better of it and settled. After the crowd drifted back to their cars in twos and threes, after thermoses were capped and the cold steadied itself, Katie stayed. She traced the edge of the plaque and told the pass what she had been rehearsing for months, that her brother had been stubborn in only the best ways, that he had left his boots by the door and his notes under a magnet shaped like a trout, that he had carried other people's lives in canvas without asking them to be lighter. She said Arthur Blake's name aloud without poison, and in doing so felt a knot loosen in a place she could not name. She did not rewrite what he had done. She only allowed the mountain to hold both men, because it always had. Elena joined her at the rail, hands bare against the cold on purpose. She looked down the run where the avalanche had cut and said, almost to herself, "We did what we could." Katie nodded. "We did what he would have done," she answered. "We finished the route." Back in town, the post office made a small space on a side wall, neither shrine nor curiosity, simply a narrow shelf with three objects: a photograph of Daniel in his blue jacket, the photocopy of the Snowbound Letter with names redacted, and a thin ledger where visitors could sign if they wished. The first line belonged to the gas station owner's son, who wrote, "Thank you for carrying." The second line was a child's crooked Daniel, written as if names could be gifts. Deliveries became, absurdly and perfectly, a little different after that. People met the carrier at the gate with a wave instead of a nod. They handheld stamped envelopes an extra beat before handing them over, the way you linger with a handshake to keep a person in the doorway a moment longer. A man who had never written a letter wrote one to his father and discovered the quiet ecstasy of folding paper, of creasing it just so, of sealing the gum with his own breath and believing in the moment of surrender at the blue box. A woman who had hoarded anger mailed a list of grievances to her own address, opened it when it arrived, laughed, and let some of it go. When the first storm of the new winter moved in, with less fury than 1992, but with the same old muscle, Katie made one last visit to the cemetery. She brought the cassette player, its buttons spongy with age, and pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the little square of air above the headstone, late and present at once. She tucked her chin into her scarf and listened to him forget a lyric and laugh. Snow began to fall in flakes big enough to count. She placed the wheat penny on the stone where the afternoon light would find it even in short days. "We carried you as far as we could," she said. "You can walk with us from here." Elena sent her final memo to the file the next morning. It was short. It stated what was already known, that the Glacier had yielded a leather mailbag, that inside, one envelope had been opened, containing a typed confession from Arthur Blake, that fingerprints had matched, that forensics had confirmed a gunshot prior to avalanche, that Daniel Mercer's body had been recovered near the bag, that after 37 years, the storm had given up its secret. She added one unsanctioned sentence at the bottom, a line that would never matter to a court and meant everything to those who had watched the town do its work. Trust, once bent, was lifted in pieces and set straight by many hands. She closed the folder and did not open it again. Snow fell. Trucks chained up and leaned into the grade. The wooden letters box at Mercer's Bend filled and emptied and filled again, the notes inside bleeding ink into the grain and still somehow legible, because intention, like certain blues, held even when the paper forgot. Hikers paused and read the plaque and said the name of in January 1992, 41-year-old postal worker Daniel Mercer, the way you say the name of a relative you never met but feel you understand. They said Arthur Blake's name, too, and learned that saying it did not contaminate the air but cleared it. In the miner's rest, someone taped a copy of the postal creed above the tip jar. In kitchens, butter knives lifted again under envelope flaps. In classrooms, children wrote their first letters, invented addresses, and giggled at the mystery of an unseen network that would carry their words to the right doors. The town did the most ordinary and therefore the holiest thing it could do. It kept sending and receiving, kept trusting that a thing released would arrive. On a night when the moon made the past shine like hammered tin, Katie stood at her window and watched the plow trace its patient line, a bright insect moving against vastness. The phone number slip, the penny, the tape, the photograph, her small reliquary, sat on the sill the way stars sit on a good sky, not to explain anything, just to make the dark less empty. She did not pray. She did not need to. The route was complete. And so the story that began when in January 1992, 41-year-old postal worker Daniel Mercer left Silverton to beat a storm, and did not, came to rest where all true stories do, not in spectacle, not in vengeance, but in the steady, ordinary faith that bound a town to a man and a man to his work. A leather bag thawed, a letter confessed, a body returned, and an old creed breathed again under fluorescent light. After 37 years, the storm gave up its secret. The snowbound letter was revealed. The mail went out the next morning.